lest her unhappiness should acquire a sting that would leave traces beyond the passing moment. The room in which she sat was the only one on the ground floor except the dining room and kitchen. It was therefore used both as parlour and sitting room, and held not only her piano but her husband's desk. Communicating with it was the tiny dining room. Between the two, however, was an entry leading to a side entrance. A lamp was in this entry, and she had left it burning, as well as the one in the kitchen, that the house might look cheerful and as if all the family were at home. She was looking toward this entry and wondering whether it was the mist made by her tears that made it look so dismally dark to her, when there came a faint sound from the door at its furthest end. But no further sound came from that direction, and after a few minutes of silent terror she was allowing herself to believe that she had been deceived by her fears, when she suddenly heard the same sound at the kitchen door, followed by a muffled knock. Frightened now in good earnest, but still alive to the fact that the intruder was as likely to be a friend as a foe, she stepped to the door, and with her hand on the lock stooped and asked boldly enough who was there. But she received no answer, and more affected by this unexpected silence than by the knock she had heard, she recoiled farther and farther till not only the width of the kitchen, but the dining room also, lay between her and the scene of her alarm. When, to her utter confusion, the noise shifted again to the side of the house, and the door she thought so securely fastened swung violently open as if blown in by a fierce gust, and she saw precipitated into the entry the burly figure of a man, covered with snow and shaking with the violence of the storm that seemed at once to fill the house. Her first thought was that it was her husband come back, but before she could clear her eyes from the cloud of snow which had entered with him, he had thrown off his outer covering, and she found herself face to face with a man in whose powerful frame and cynical visage she saw little to comfort her and much to surprise and alarm. "Ugh!" was his coarse and rather familiar greeting. "A hard night, missus. Enough to drive any man indoors. Pardon the liberty, but I couldn't wait for you to lift the latch. The wind drove me right in." Was not the door locked?" she feebly asked, thinking he must have staved it in with his foot, that looked only too well fitted for such a task. "Not much," he chuckled. "I suppose you're too hospital for that." And his eyes passed from her face to the comfortable firelight shining through the sitting room. "Is it refuge you want?" she demanded, suppressing as much as possible all signs of fear. "Sure, missus. What else? A man can't live in a gale like that, specially after a tramp of 20 miles or more. Shall I shut the door for you?" he asked, with a mixture of bravado and good nature that frightened her more and more. "I will shut it," she replied, with half a notion of escaping the sinister stranger by a flight through the night. But one glance into the swirling snowstorm deterred her, and making the best of the alarming situation, she closed the door, but did not lock it, being more afraid now of what was inside the house than of anything left to threaten her from without. The man, whose clothes were dripping with water, watched her with a cynical smile, and then, without any invitation, entered the dining room, crossed it, and moved toward the kitchen fire. "Ugh, ugh, but it's warm here," he cried, his nostrils dilating with an animal-like enjoyment that in itself was repugnant to her womanly delicacies. "Do you know, missus, I shall have to stay here all night. Can't go out in that gale again. Not such a fool!" Then, with a sly look at her trembling form and white face, he insinuatingly added, "All alone, missus?" The suddenness with which this was put, together with the leer that accompanied it, made her start. Alone? Yes, but should she acknowledge it? Would it not be better to say that her husband was upstairs? The man evidently saw the struggle going on in her mind, for he chuckled to himself and called out quite boldly: "Never mind, missus, it's all right. Just give me a bit of cold meat and a cup of tea or something, and we'll be very comfortable together. You're a slender slip of a woman to be minding a house like this. I'll keep you company if you don't mind, leastwise until the storm lets up a bit, which ain't likely for some hours to come. Rough night, missus, rough night." "I expect my husband home any time," she hastened to say, and thinking she saw a change in the man's countenance at this she put on quite an air of sudden satisfaction and bounded towards the front of the house. "There, I think I hear him now," she cried. Her motive was to gain time, and if possible to obtain the opportunity of shifting the money from the place where she had first put it into another and safer one. "I want to be able," she thought, "of swearing that I have no money with me in this house. If I can only get it into my apron, I will drop it outside the door into the snowbank. It will be as safe there as in the bank it came from." And dashing into the sitting-room, she made a feint of dragging down a shawl from a screen, while she secretly filled her skirt with the bills which had been put between some old pamphlets on the bookshelves. She could hear the man grumbling in the kitchen, but he did not follow her front, and taking advantage of the moment's respite from his none too encouraging presence, she unbarred the door and cheerfully called out her husband's name. The ruse was successful. She was able to fling the notes where the falling flakes would soon cover them from sight, and feeling more courageous, now that the money was out of the house, she went slowly back, saying she had made a mistake, and that it was the wind she had heard. The man gave a gruff but knowing guffaw, and then resumed his watch over her, following her steps as she proceeded to set him out a meal, with a persistency that reminded her of a tiger just on the point of springing. But the inviting looks of the viands with which she was rapidly setting the table soon distracted his attention, and allowing himself one grunt of satisfaction, he drew up a chair and sat himself down to what to him was evidently a most savoury repast. "No beer, no ale, nothin' o' that sort, eh? Don't keep a bar?" he growled, as his teeth closed on a huge hunk of bread. She shook her head, wishing she had a little cold poison bottled up in a tight-looking jug. "Nothing but tea," she smiled, astonished at her own ease of manner in the presence of this alarming guest. "Then let's have that," he grumbled, taking the bowl she handed him, with an odd look that made her glad to retreat to the other side of the room. "Just listen to the howling wind," he went on between the huge mouthfuls of bread and cheese with which he was gorging himself. "But we're very comfortable, we two. We don't mind the storm, do we?" Shocked by his familiarity, and still more moved by the look of mingled inquiry and curiosity with which his eyes now began to wander over the walls and cupboards, she took an anxious step towards the side of the house looking toward her neighbours, and lifting one of the shades, which had all been religiously pulled down, she looked out. A swirl of snowflakes alone confronted her. She could neither see her neighbours, nor could she be seen by them. A shout from her to them would not be heard. She was as completely isolated as if the house stood in the centre of a desolated western plain. "I have no trust but in God," she murmured as she came from the window. And, nerved to meet her fate, she crossed to the kitchen. It was now 10:30. 2